The girl was 12 when the promise was made, sealed in whispers that nobody outside the family dared to hear. The house they lived in crouched at the edge of the woods, a forest that seemed to breathe in the wind, its trees whispering secrets only the brave or foolish could ever hope to understand. Nights were long and heavy, filled with the low hum of insects and the rustle of unseen creatures moving just beyond the windows. Her cousin, older by 6 years, watched her with eyes that carried both expectation and an unsettling patience, and the villagers, when they dared to glance their way, would avert their gaze, murmuring half-truths about the children born of such unions. It was in that shadowed house, under the oppressive weight of family traditions and half-forgotten oaths, that the first miracle, or perhaps the first warning, took shape. A child was conceived, against the odds, a fragile life that pulsed with a quiet defiance. When it came into the world, doctors scratched their heads, science offered no answers, and the village held its breath. The woods beyond seemed to lean closer, dark branches reaching toward the house as if to observe, and an uneasy chill settled over the family. Something old, something hungry, had been awakened, and the child, innocent and unknowing, had become the focal point of a secret that had slumbered for generations. The air itself seemed to thrum with anticipation, and no one could say if the coming days would bring salvation or doom. At 12, she was still a child in every sense, though the village had already begun to shape her future with hands she did not fully understand. Her small frame moved quietly through the house, careful not to disturb the adults who spoke in hushed tones about arrangements that seemed both inevitable and incomprehensible. The promise that bound her to her cousin was spoken once in solemn words, accompanied by a ritual of candlelight and incense, the smoke curling toward the ceiling like it carried her fate along with it. She did not fully grasp what was being said, only that eyes pressed upon her with expectation, that whispers carried weight she could feel in her chest. Her parents' faces were unreadable, drawn tight with a mixture of pride and fear, as if the future they envisioned was a fragile glass object they dared not drop. The cousin, older and more assured, stood nearby, his presence an uncomfortable gravity that she could not escape. In that moment, the woods surrounding the village seemed to lean closer, the trees casting shadows that fell across the walls of the room in long, unnatural angles. There was a sense of permanence to the promise that the adults treated as simple custom, but she felt it as something heavier, a chain invisible yet palpable, looping around her small wrists and threading through her mind with every glance from her family. In the evenings, when the candlelight flickered and the house grew quiet except for the occasional creak of the wooden floorboards, she would lie awake listening to the wind in the trees and imagine herself slipping through the cracks of the world, beyond the grasp of obligations that had been spoken over her before she even understood her own name. Her cousin's presence followed her into the hallways and the kitchen, a shadow that mirrored her own movements, and she realized with a creeping unease that this bond was not like the casual friendships she had seen between other children. It was a tether meant to pull her forward into a life already written. In the village, the elders nodded to each other in quiet satisfaction, seeing the continuation of lineage and tradition, unaware of the subtle tension woven into her thoughts. Sometimes she caught glimpses of older children staring from the outskirts of the fields, their eyes carrying both curiosity and warning, as if they knew what awaited her and feared it in ways she did not yet comprehend. The promise was more than words. It was the quiet acceptance of a future that had begun to take root while she still held the last fragile threads of childhood in her hands. In the shadows of her own home, surrounded by walls that listened and trees that watched, she felt the weight of generations pressing down, a weight that would follow her even as she tried to run toward a freedom she was only beginning to imagine. The candlelight would burn low, the room growing colder as the wind pressed against the shutters, and the knowledge that her life had been set along this path settled slowly into her bones, leaving her with a mixture of dread, curiosity, and a sense that the world she knew was only the first chapter of something much darker. The family she was born into was a labyrinth of secrets, each hallway and room holding echoes of stories that were never meant for outsiders. Whispers moved through the household like a persistent draft, slipping beneath doors and curling around corners, carrying warnings disguised as casual conversation. Old photographs lined the walls, faces frozen in time, eyes that seemed too knowing, too aware of the hidden currents running through the bloodline. Each generation had its peculiarities, little quirks that neighbors noticed but never questioned too closely, habits that hinted at something deeper, something buried beneath the surface of ordinary life. In the attic, bundles of yellowed letters and journals lay stacked in careful disorder, pages filled with accounts of children born malformed or sickly, of parents who murmured prayers or curses depending on the circumstances, of doctors who left shaking their heads and scribbling reports that made little sense. These were not stories spoken aloud, but fragments caught in snatches of conversation, half-forgotten warnings that lingered like smoke in the air. The adults spoke of lineage and duty, of preserving what had survived despite hardship, and in their voices there was a rhythm that felt almost ritualistic, as if repeating the words alone would hold some malevolent force at bay. She began to notice the oddities, small details that no child should understand, a cousin who never ventured beyond certain rooms, aunts who avoided mirrors, doors that were locked with no explanation. The very walls of the house seemed to watch, echoing footsteps with a timing that suggested the house itself had memory, that it retained knowledge of the generations that had come before her. Outside, the woods pressed close, their shadows merging with the dark corners of the home, carrying rumors of strange sounds and fleeting shapes that no one could fully explain. Family gatherings were tense with unspoken histories, each smile and nod carrying weight, each glance over the shoulder hinting at knowledge too dangerous to share. She could feel the invisible threads connecting everyone, a network of secrets and silence, a web spun over decades that she was only beginning to glimpse. At night, the wind whispered against the shutters as if reminding her that the past was not gone, that the lineage she belonged to was both a heritage and a cage. She sensed the presence of something unresolved, the residue of choices and mistakes from generations past, pressing down on the present with a quiet insistence. Her young mind tried to piece together fragments of understanding, to reconcile the love she felt from her family with the eerie tension that shadowed every interaction, and in those moments of clarity, she realized that the house itself, the family itself, was a puzzle with pieces that could never fully fit together, a legacy of mysteries that would shape her future in ways she could not yet comprehend. As she grew, the lines between fear and fascination began to blur, and her cousin, once a distant figure in her life, became an ever-present force she could neither escape nor fully understand. At first, she noticed him in small ways, the way he lingered near the kitchen when she moved from room to room, the soft murmur of his voice when speaking to others that always seemed to carry a subtle undertone meant only for her. There was a tension in the air whenever they were near each other, a silent electricity that made her skin prickle and her chest tighten. Her feelings were confusing, a mixture of dread and an inexplicable pull, a recognition that she was bound to him by more than just the promise made years ago. It was in the quiet afternoons, when the sun slanted through the trees and spilled golden light across the worn floors, that she felt the weight of it most keenly. Their eyes would meet, and something unspoken passed between them, a fleeting connection that both unsettled and intrigued her. She began to notice subtle changes in herself, an awareness of his gaze following her in the hallways, the way her pulse quickened when he spoke directly to her, the small shiver that traveled down her spine at the brush of his hand, accidental or otherwise. The adults dismissed such things as growing pains or childish imagination, but she felt that the intensity of their bond went beyond mere kinship or obedience. In the village, rumors swirled quietly around families who followed the old ways, whispers of relationships that were not quite right yet endured, of connections that defied simple morality. She heard these murmurs, sometimes catching fragments at the edge of conversation, and a strange thrill mixed with fear twisted in her stomach. Nights were the hardest, when the house was silent except for the wind moving through the trees outside. In those hours, she would lie awake listening to the familiar creaks of the floors and the soft footfalls elsewhere in the house, imagining what it might be like to confront the pull she felt, to acknowledge the bond that seemed to have grown alongside her, hidden but undeniable. Her cousin's presence was constant, a shadow and a mirror, reflecting both the future she had been promised and the darker curiosity that had begun to take root within her. She could sense the villagers' eyes on them whenever they appeared together, the half-glances that suggested suspicion or unease, and yet the intensity of her own awareness could not be quelled by whispers alone. Something unspoken lingered in every conversation, every shared glance, a tension that hinted at what was forbidden but inevitable, a force neither fully understood nor easily resisted, binding them together in ways that would shape the years to come. Beyond the edges of the village lay the woods, a place the adults spoke of only in cautious tones, a forest that seemed to breathe and watch, where shadows moved as if alive and the wind carried whispers that had no source. Children were warned never to stray too far, yet she found herself drawn to its darkened paths, an irresistible curiosity tugging at her small frame. The trees grew close and tall, their trunks twisted in shapes that suggested more than mere growth, as though the forest itself had been shaped by centuries of secrets. Sunlight struggled to pierce the thick canopy, leaving the undergrowth in a permanent twilight where moss clung damply to stones and leaves rustled with the sound of unseen creatures. It was in that half-light that she first noticed things that did not belong to ordinary life, footprints that ended abruptly in clearings, shadows that lingered longer than they should, and the faint glimmer of eyes reflecting something ancient and intelligent from deep within the brush. The village elders spoke in hushed voices of the wood's strange power, of travelers who vanished or returned changed, of animals behaving in unnatural ways, and of lights that appeared at night with no explanation, flickering between the trees like distant stars come to earth. She would wander the paths silently, feeling the weight of the forest pressing in from all sides, sensing the stories woven into its soil and roots. There were places where the air grew colder, where the wind carried the faintest scent of iron and smoke, and the trees seemed to lean closer, as if listening. In those moments, fear and fascination merged, and she felt both insignificant and acutely aware of some hidden intelligence surrounding her. On more than one occasion, she glimpsed shapes moving just at the edge of her vision, quick, deliberate, and impossible to place, leaving her heart racing and her thoughts tangled between wonder and terror. The cousin, when he accompanied her, seemed equally drawn, yet more composed, navigating the same shadows with a knowing ease that made her feel both protected and exposed. There was a rhythm to the forest, a pulse she could feel beneath her feet and in her chest, as though it had a heartbeat, as though it could sense the growing tension within her family and the promise that had been made years before. Nights in the woods were different, the darkness thickened, and every sound became magnified, every rustle of leaves a potential omen. Yet the child in her, a girl growing toward an understanding of her own place in the world, could not resist the allure, the sense that something vital waited among the trees, something connected to her future, to the secrets of her family, and to the mystery of a life that science and superstition alike would struggle to comprehend. The forest was alive, and it watched, patient and silent, as if it had been waiting for her all along. The first attempt at starting a family was shrouded in tension, a quiet dread that none of them fully understood but all seemed to sense. The adults prepared the household with rituals half-remembered from older generations, lighting candles in precise patterns, murmuring prayers and incantations that mingled hope with fear. She, still young and uncertain, felt the weight of expectation pressing down on her chest, a constant reminder that her body and future belonged not only to herself but to the lineage she had been promised to continue. Her cousin was both patient and distant, his hands gentle when they needed to be, yet always carrying the sense of purpose and authority that made her feel small, like a figure in a story much larger than she could comprehend. Days passed in a haze of quiet preparation and whispered instructions, with neighbors avoiding their gaze and children stealing glances from across the fields, sensing that something strange and secret was unfolding behind the closed doors of the family home. When the time came, it was neither dramatic nor violent. It was a slow, almost mechanical act performed under the careful observation of tradition and expectation, a convergence of obligation and instinct. Yet the result was immediate in its tragedy. The child, fragile and malformed, did not survive beyond the first hours, and the house, once alive with muted anticipation, was plunged into a hollow silence. The doctors who had been summoned shook their heads and spoke in measured tones, unable to explain what had gone wrong, while the adults exchanged looks that balanced grief, fear, and the subtle understanding that the failure was more than just misfortune. In the nights that followed, the house seemed to breathe differently, the shadows stretching longer and colder across the floors, as if mourning with them or warning them of unseen forces beyond human comprehension. Rumors began to stir in the village, half-whispered accounts of past generations who had endured similar fates, of children born strange and weak, and of families whose bloodlines seemed cursed or chosen for reasons no one dared articulate. She felt the weight of that history pressing on her, a tension she could not name, an awareness that the promise made years ago carried consequences she had never anticipated. Even her cousin, composed and silent, seemed to shift in the wake of the loss, his eyes carrying a new gravity, a mixture of sorrow and unease that mirrored her own confusion. The air itself seemed heavier, thick with unspoken questions and unacknowledged fears, leaving her with a sense that the tragedy was not simply an accident but part of a pattern, a web of forces, human, natural, and perhaps something far older, that they had stepped into without full understanding. In the quiet corners of the house, where candlelight flickered and shadows trembled, she began to sense that the future they sought to create would not be simple, that the promise binding her to her cousin had set in motion events that neither tradition nor science could easily explain, and that the forest outside waited patiently, its dark heart observing every falter and failure. Against every expectation, a child was born who seemed to defy the silent weight of history pressing upon the family, a fragile life that pulsed with a quiet, almost stubborn vitality. The moment of birth carried a tension unlike anything before. The house was filled with a breathless stillness, the kind that precedes miracles or disasters, and the adults hovered in silence, eyes wide with disbelief. Doctors had predicted frailty or deformity, drawing on grim experiences and statistics that should have dictated a sorrowful outcome, yet here was a baby whose cries were strong, whose pulse was steady, whose tiny hands grasped instinctively at the air as if claiming a place in a world that had not seemed ready to receive it. She, the mother, felt a mixture of relief and unease, a deep, instinctive recognition that something about this child was different, as though the lineage, the promise, and the shadowed history had combined to produce an anomaly neither fully human nor entirely explained by nature. Whispers began to circulate quietly through the household, muffled and tense, carrying astonishment mingled with fear. The villagers, too, soon learned of the child's survival, and the ordinary explanations offered by doctors and midwives were insufficient to soothe the ripples of awe and suspicion that spread like wind through the tightly knit community. People spoke in low voices of past generations, of children lost too soon, of families haunted by invisible forces, and now of this one child who seemed to bend the rules of life itself. Even within the family, reactions were fractured. Some saw a blessing, the hand of Providence finally favoring their bloodline, while others shivered at the thought that this child might carry a weight or power too complex and mysterious to understand. At night, the baby's cries echoed differently, resonating through the walls as if calling attention to an unseen presence, and the wind outside carried strange sounds that seemed to answer in kind, whispering secrets she could not yet interpret. The trees of the surrounding woods appeared to lean closer, their shadows stretching toward the house, the branches creaking in rhythms that mirrored the rise and fall of the child's chest. She sensed that this survival was no accident, no mere fluke of chance or biology. It was a signal, a mark that forces older than the family's traditions were at play, shaping and watching this life with quiet patience. The mother's thoughts were a jumble of wonder, fear, and protectiveness, her instincts sharpened in ways she had not known possible, as though the survival of the child demanded vigilance not only against disease or accident but against the unseen eyes that lingered just beyond comprehension. And as she held the child close, feeling the warmth and the steady heartbeat against her own, she knew that this tiny life had become the fulcrum of a mystery that no amount of knowledge or science could fully contain, a fragile center around which the shadows of the past, the forest, and the family's legacy would twist and gather in ways that were only beginning to unfold. As the child grew, it became impossible for the villagers to ignore the strange phenomena that seemed to orbit her existence, subtle at first but increasingly impossible to dismiss. Animals that once roamed freely hesitated at the edges of the property, their movements jerky and alert, eyes glinting with something unnervingly aware. Birds would circle overhead in unnatural patterns, calling out in discordant cries that carried long into the night. Even the weather seemed to respond to her presence, sudden gusts of wind rattling the shutters and bending the trees as if the world itself were attuned to her heartbeat. Neighbors spoke in cautious whispers, claiming glimpses of fleeting shapes near the windows, or shadows that moved independently of the people who cast them. Within the family, reactions were divided and raw. Some embraced the child as a miraculous gift, the embodiment of hope and continuity after generations of misfortune and loss. Others could not hide their unease, perceiving in her eyes and gestures a depth of awareness that unsettled even the most stoic adults. The cousin, now older and more firmly entwined with the family's fate, remained protective yet tense, his glances toward her filled with an unspoken calculation, as if trying to measure the boundaries of forces he could sense but not name. At night, the house seemed alive in ways that defied explanation. Doors creaked open of their own accord, soft footsteps echoed in empty hallways, and the faint, intermittent glow of lights appeared beyond the curtains, hovering as though drawn to the child's presence. The mother, increasingly watchful, noticed that the child responded to things no one else could perceive, pausing mid-step, gazing toward empty corners, or laughing quietly at sounds that never came from anywhere visible. Journals hidden in the attic, long forgotten by previous generations, hinted at similar occurrences, with ancestors documenting inexplicable events around children who survived against impossible odds, suggesting that the family's bloodline carried more than just genetic inheritance. The village's collective gaze grew heavier, a tension that pressed in from all sides, a quiet scrutiny fueled by awe, fear, and superstition. Visitors would avert their eyes or leave hurriedly, and the whispers of omens began to intertwine with everyday life. Yet the child remained untouched, thriving despite the unease that surrounded her, her vitality and peculiar awareness only intensifying the sense that she was a pivot point for something larger than anyone could define. The woods outside the house, dark and dense, seemed to lean ever closer, shadows pressing toward the windows, leaves rustling in patterns that mimicked her movements, as if the forest itself recognized a connection. She was at once ordinary and extraordinary, and those who observed her could not help but feel that the ordinary rules of life were bending around her presence, that each glance, each step, each breath she took was subtly reshaping the world around her in ways that would become impossible to ignore. The family began to fracture under the weight of the child's presence, a tension that had been simmering beneath polite conversation and cautious smiles now rising to the surface in subtle arguments and lingering glances. Some members embraced the child as a symbol of hope, proof that their bloodline had endured where countless others had faltered, a miraculous defiance of science and tradition alike. They treated her with gentle reverence, careful to shield her from harm and nurture the extraordinary spark of vitality that seemed to pulse in her every movement. Others recoiled, unable to shake the unease that clung to her like a second skin, sensing that her survival was more than a stroke of fortune and that some hidden consequence had come tethered to her existence. In whispered corners of the house, the older generation spoke in hushed tones of curses and blessings, of missteps that could reverberate across lifetimes, and of a lineage that had long been entwined with forces they barely understood. The child herself was largely unaware of the tension she created, yet instinctively responsive to it. She would flinch at sharp voices, pause at the edge of heated arguments, and sometimes retreat into silence, eyes fixed on corners of the room where nothing appeared to exist. Outside the walls of the home, the villagers sensed the shift in the family as well, noting how some relatives lingered protectively close to the child while others remained at a calculated distance, their expressions shadowed with concern or fear. Rumors began to circulate with renewed intensity, mutterings of unnatural occurrences, whispered stories of children who should not have survived, and the strange phenomena that always seemed to follow this one child. Even the cousin, once steady and composed, now carried a visible tension, a careful calculation in his interactions that suggested a deep concern for the balance of forces he could neither name nor fully control. The child's survival had inadvertently become a litmus test for the family's unity, revealing fractures that had been long ignored, cracks hidden beneath generations of tradition and obligation. Arguments over care, over attention, over the meaning of her existence began to arise, subtle at first but growing steadily, each one leaving a residue of unease that clung to the rooms long after the voices had faded. At night, the house seemed to mirror the turmoil within, shadows stretching across walls, doors creaking open without reason, and the wind whispering through cracks as though carrying secrets from one room to another. The forest beyond the property loomed silently, its presence a constant reminder that forces outside human comprehension were observing, patient and deliberate, as if waiting for the family to fracture completely or for the child to step fully into the role that destiny, or some older, darker power, had laid out for her. The divisions deepened slowly, threading through daily routines and quiet interactions, shaping a household that was at once protective and fearful, loving and wary, united and dangerously divided by the living proof of a mystery no one could explain. It was in the quiet corners of the attic, among dust-covered boxes and brittle, yellowed papers, that the family's deepest secrets began to surface, revealing a pattern of choices and experiments that stretched back generations. Hidden journals, once thought to be mere records of daily life, contained meticulous notes detailing past attempts to manipulate the family's lineage, accounts of children born weak or deformed, and careful observations of rituals and remedies intended to preserve certain traits. The handwriting was uneven, sometimes frantic, sometimes precise, but always carrying a sense of urgency, as if the author understood the fragile line between success and disaster. Letters sealed with wax and hidden beneath floorboards hinted at arrangements made between relatives, contracts written in secrecy, and instructions to maintain traditions that combined superstition with deliberate manipulation of bloodlines. She, now old enough to read and comprehend more than she had as a child, began piecing together fragments of this hidden history, realizing that the survival of the child was not entirely accidental. Ancestors had worked tirelessly, sometimes cruelly, to produce offspring who could endure when others could not, blending belief and experimentation in ways that blurred morality and necessity. The discovery of these records sent ripples of unease through the family, for while some members had suspected unusual methods in the past, few had confronted the reality of what had been done. It became clear that the unusual phenomena surrounding the surviving child were not merely random or supernatural, but intertwined with generations of deliberate acts, choices made in shadowed rooms under the guidance of desperation, ambition, and faith. The cousin, who had once been a steady, protective presence, now regarded the child with a mixture of awe and apprehension, understanding that her very existence was the culmination of these hidden machinations. Even the adults who had tried to shield her from the past could not deny the weight of this revelation. The lineage was not simply a matter of survival or fortune, but of carefully orchestrated continuity, with the child at the center of a legacy that combined science, superstition, and an unsettling sense of inevitability. The air of the house shifted subtly as the knowledge spread, a tension that hovered like a low mist over conversations and meals, over every glance and gesture, as if the walls themselves absorbed the unearthed truth and carried it silently from room to room. Outside, the forest seemed to acknowledge the discovery, its shadows stretching closer, the branches creaking as though in quiet commentary, a reminder that forces older than any human hand were watching the unfolding story. The child's vitality, her survival, and the subtle powers that had begun to manifest were now seen in a new light, not just as miracles or anomalies, but as the logical, terrifying consequence of generations who had carefully shaped life itself. The family, caught between reverence and fear, understood that the secrets of the past were not dormant, they were living, breathing influences that had positioned the child as the pivot of a story that was only beginning to reveal its true scope. As the child grew, a sense of looming threat settled over the household, subtle at first, then more insistent, as if the shadows themselves were tightening their grip. The forest beyond the property seemed less like a distant boundary and more like an entity pressing against the edges of their lives, its darkened canopy shifting and whispering with a consciousness that felt almost deliberate. Strange sounds came with increasing frequency, branches snapping in patterns that mirrored the child's steps, the low murmur of wind carrying voices she could not place, and fleeting glimpses of shapes that dissolved when she or her cousin tried to focus. The villagers, once merely curious, began avoiding the house altogether, their hushed glances now tinged with genuine fear. Stories circulated of other families who had dared to defy nature or tradition, and though no one spoke them aloud near the house, the air was heavy with the sense that some unseen forces were aware, watching, calculating, and waiting. Within the family, tension mounted as the adults grappled with the implications of the child's survival and the signs that accompanied her. The cousin, vigilant and wary, would sometimes stand silently by the windows for long stretches, eyes scanning the tree line with an intensity that made the air in the room feel charged. The mother, protective and wary, felt a constant shiver of apprehension, a sense that danger was not only possible but imminent. Even the child herself seemed to sense it at times, pausing in mid-step to stare toward the woods, her small hands clenching and unclenching as though reaching for something invisible, her expression carrying the weight of awareness that no ordinary child should possess. The house itself seemed to pulse in response, floors creaking and walls shifting as if acknowledging the tension, shadows deepening and stretching in ways that defied the position of the candlelight. Nights became particularly fraught, the wind pressed harder against shutters, faint lights appeared among the trees, and the cries of distant animals sounded almost human in their cadence, a chorus of warning or anticipation. Whispers of doom threaded through the family's conversations, though none dared articulate them fully, and every action became measured, every decision weighed for its potential to provoke forces they could not control. The cumulative effect was suffocating, an invisible pressure that pressed on their shoulders and hearts, a reminder that the child's existence was more than a miracle, it was a beacon, drawing attention from realms they barely comprehended. There was an unspoken understanding that the child's life, extraordinary as it was, carried risks beyond human reckoning, that the woods, the family, and the hidden threads of lineage were all converging on a threshold they had been unwittingly approaching for generations. And as the wind stirred the branches outside, rattling the windows and shaking the walls, the realization settled deep in their bones that the child's survival was not simply a beginning, it was an invitation, a challenge, and a harbinger of dangers that would demand vigilance, courage, and perhaps sacrifices no one yet dared imagine.